So I'm going to go through how to answer the 16-mark questions. Now, you do get a 16-mark question in each of the 3 papers, but they all are slightly different. So the one we're going to go through today is from paper 2, so there's no spelling, punctuation and grammar marks for this particular question. And in paper 1 and 2, you will be given a choice of 2 essays, and you choose the one that you know most about to be able to get the most marks. The questions are marked out of 16. In order to get the high level, you need to ensure you show a balanced argument. So by that, it means you need to have something that agrees with the statement in the question and something that disagrees with the statement in the question. It doesn't need to be an equal amount, but you just need to have that balanced argument. Now, here is the question we're going to go through. So, the attitude of the papacy was the main reason why Catholic opposition to Elizabeth increased in the years 1559 to 1588. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. You may use the following in your answer: excommunication, Mary Queen of Scots. You must also use information of your own. Now, this is a clear example of why it's important that you're keeping a glossary or keeping a record of particular words that are relevant to the topic, because I know lots of students who sat this paper in 2019 were put off by the word papacy and by the word excommunication. Now, papacy is anything to do with the Pope, so we're talking about how did the attitude and really the actions of the Pope increase Catholic opposition to Elizabeth, and excommunication is when Elizabeth was completely cut out from the Catholic Church, sort of disowned by the Pope, as it were. Now, this mark scheme for this question is divided into 4 levels, just like the 12-mark one. So level 1, simple generalized answer, limited knowledge, overall judgment is missing. So we're really looking at a few sentences for that one. Level 2, it might be a little bit more than a few sentences, but it won't be focused on the question. There'll be limited analysis, but there will be some accurate and relevant information. For level 3, we're looking at much more detailed answer, with lots of explanation and analysis. So you're looking for your sentence starters that show you're explaining. So this meant that, as a result, as a consequence, you need to make sure you're linking back to the question, and you show good knowledge and understanding of the time period. It's important to know that you cannot get to level 4 without saying something from your own knowledge, expanding on something from your own knowledge. So if you only talk about the points mentioned in the question, you're not going to get to level 4. So with level 4, it's talking about you having an analytical explanation, consistently focused on the question, a clear line of reasoning, and your essay needs to be logically structured. There also needs to be accurate, relevant information. They talk about that information being used precisely to address the question. Now we're going to have a look at a student's example from last year. So I'm just going to say quickly, actually, this first sentence is not important. You don't need to do an introduction. This kind of introduction isn't particularly good anyway, because we know what the essay is about. We can see the question there at the top of the paper. So she then goes into her main paragraph, her first main paragraph. So she talks about the fact that the Pope didn't like some of Elizabeth's religious settlement and was discouraging members of Elizabethan society from practicing the faith that Elizabeth wanted them to practice. Now, this next paragraph is really good in terms of analysis. So she talks about how the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570. She said she can't remember if it's 1570 or 1580, but yes, she was right with 1570. So the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth, and this increased Catholic opposition because people saw the Pope go against Elizabeth through him excommunicating her. She then goes on to talk about how the Pope was seen as a role model for many, and he was a religious figure, so people would think, well, if he has excommunicated her, then that's what God would have done. She then goes on to talk about the role of Mary Queen of Scots and how that led to more Catholic or increased Catholic opposition, because as long as Mary was alive, there's going to be a threat to Elizabeth through the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots being somebody that they could involve in plots and potentially replace Elizabeth with Mary Queen of Scots and then have a Catholic monarch. She's then reached a conclusion saying, well, yes, the Pope was important, or the role of the papacy was important in increasing Catholic opposition, but then also Mary Queen of Scots, her role up until her execution was also important. So with that answer, the examiner would probably be deciding really whether it's between a level 2 or a level 3. So Is it limited analysis? Is it limited knowledge or some knowledge but not really focused on the question? Or is it focused on the question with a bit more detailed knowledge? So I think the examiner would probably spend a little bit of time choosing between level 2 or level 3 for that particular one, and it would most likely finish up at the lower end or the mid range of level 3, so maybe a level 310. So I'm going to be asking you to now write your own answer to that question, and I've started it off for you. Now, I did say you don't need an introduction, but you could just write one brief sentence. So I fully or partially agree or disagree. And then you just get straight into making your points. So the Pope encouraged Catholic opposition to Elizabeth, and this was intensified in 1570 when he issued a papal bull which excommunicated Elizabeth and actively encouraged plots against her. Following this, there was a series of plots against Elizabeth, including, so you need to mention the names of some of the plots. You could briefly talk about how they focused on Mary Queen of Scots, but you don't really need to mention that here because you're going to talk about Mary Queen of Scots in the next paragraph. The Pope also encouraged Catholics not to follow Elizabeth's religious settlement. Elizabeth's excommunication was also significant because, so why else was it important? So you could say, well, it encouraged people or monarchs from other countries, Catholic countries, to plan invasions, for example, Philip II. Therefore, the attitude of the papacy clearly caused an increase in Catholic opposition, and that opposition is both home and abroad, so you might want to mention that there as well. You then need to go on to talk about other reasons why Catholic opposition to Elizabeth increased. So start your paragraph with another key reason, or you could start with on the other hand. You don't need to start with some people say, other people say, because that's not relevant in history, but it doesn't really mean anything. So you need to get straight into actually writing about the facts rather than these vague people who may not even exist. So another key reason why Catholic opposition to Elizabeth increased was the presence of Mary Queen of Scots in England. She was a threat to Elizabeth because, so you talk about why Mary Queen of Scots was a threat, so as long as she's alive, there's somebody who could potentially be queen instead of Elizabeth. Why was her presence significant? Well, again, it caused plots against Elizabeth. So another paragraph, which doesn't need to be very long, that you could include is the revolt of the Northern Earls, so one of the first main rebellions against Elizabeth, and how that caused increased Catholic opposition because, well, it showed that there were people within the country, a very significant threat from the north, who were Catholic, and it sort of maybe encouraged other people around the country to think, well, if they're not supporting Elizabeth, maybe we shouldn't either. A further reason you could mention is because of the way Catholics began to be treated more harshly. So initially, when the religious settlement was first brought in, Elizabeth had not really enforced it particularly harshly, but she began to increase the harsh punishments as the threat to Elizabeth became more significant. So as the punishments or the treatment of Catholics became more harsh, Catholic opposition became bigger because Elizabeth was making herself unpopular. Then you need to get to your conclusion. So you need to have a final statement where you're really clear about whether you believe it's the attitude of the papacy or whether it's a combination of other reasons as to why Catholic opposition to Elizabeth increased. So just to sum up, the how far do you agree question, you have a choice of 2 essays, you choose the one that you know the most about. Questions are marked out of 16. In order to get a high level, you need to ensure you show a balanced argument, so you need to both agree and disagree with the question, and then you need to reach a clear conclusion.